Okay, good morning. We'll get started. Apologies for the technical issue, but so glad you all have found your way into this awesome session that we have here this morning. This is the second workshop in a set of 3 workshops in partnership with InnovatePGH, the University of Pittsburgh, and the PRA, looking at our life sciences ecosystem. I think the first session was fantastic, and really looking forward to the conversation today. Excited to have our partner, InnovatePGH, here, and their executive director, Sean Luther, here to moderate this morning. Just a few quick Liftoff housekeeping items for you while I have you. This is our last week of our on-demand programming leading up to our live broadcast on the 15th. So do mark your calendars for that. We have some amazing speakers lined up for our live broadcast starting around 8:30 in the morning on the 15th, as well as interactive workshops on the 16th on a variety of topics. So do check that out on the online portal. Also, as a reminder, please use your Uber Eats code to order lunch for yourselves and join one of our lunchpad discussions or networking sessions. And so without further ado, thank you again for being here. Sean, I will pass it to you and you can take it over. You're muted.
It is, you can tell it's week 2 of Liftoff. Now everything is exploding in front of us, including the content. Really excited to be back for the second in a 3-part examination of Pittsburgh's health tech ecosystem. Thanks, first of all, to Mara and Megan and the Liftoff team for hosting this. We're really excited to continue sharing what's happening in the Pittsburgh life science ecosystem. As Mara said, I'm Sean Luther. I'm the executive director of InnovatePGH. And thanks to support from the Hillman Foundation, we're very excited to have our Pittsburgh Innovation District as a sponsor for Liftoff this year. And also want to thank our partners at the Pittsburgh Regional Alliance, Kyle and Camille, who I think are in the audience, for helping us to put this series together. So a quick recap, as Mara said, last week we reviewed kind of the foundational elements of what makes Pittsburgh the #1 emerging life sciences hub in the country. And, just to make sure that everyone has that level setting, we continue to point towards our life science anchors at Pitt and UPMC, which combined represent the largest academic medical center in the country and the only one with an integrated health insurance provider. Down the street, we integrate CMU, which adds its own depth in life science and science research and bioengineering and brain-computer interface, but also obviously integrates expertise in AI, robotics, and computer engineering into our innovation and life science innovation platforms. And the combination of these 2 world-class institutions really uniquely positions Pittsburgh as a global leader in life sciences in general. But we're going to talk a little bit today, especially the intersection of artificial intelligence and life science, and really emerging strengths and exciting next generation technologies in human mobility, health IT, and really everywhere that those 2 really exciting innovation platforms intersect. And all of this happens in a very dense space in Pittsburgh. So all of our panelists today are working in a 1.5 square mile Pittsburgh Innovation District in Oakland. And I think we're going to continue unpacking what the academic strengths, what the innovation district, and what the region as a whole has to offer for life sciences. Today, our goal is to highlight the new infrastructure that's coming in and out of the ground on the life sciences front. So when we say infrastructure, that's not just bricks and mortar, though John Grady is here from Wexford to talk about the real estate investments that are happening supporting life science innovation, but also the programmatic infrastructure. And we're excited to have Peter Allen here from the University of Pittsburgh's Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship to talk about that programmatic infrastructure, that software component to the hardware that Wexford is delivering, and how that powers Pittsburgh's rise as a global health tech innovation hub. And really to examine what that infrastructure can mean, we have Anne Germain, who is the founder and CEO of Noctum, which is a startup headquartered in the Pittsburgh Innovation District focused on the health tech system. So by 11 o'clock in 51 minutes, you should walk away from this session with an understanding of why, how, and what Pittsburgh is doing to advance the next decade of life science ecosystem investments. You'll be able to identify how you, whether you're an entrepreneur, researcher, or corporate partner, can participate in that rise as Pittsburgh as a global health tech innovation hub, either through an accelerator, a translation program, or real estate opportunities. And we're going to share with you a firsthand glimpse into the impact of the health tech investments on Pittsburgh's broader innovation ecosystem. So a quick reminder, our format today is a moderated discussion. So I'm just going to be fielding some early questions to Peter, Anne, and John. I'm going to have each of them make a quick introduction before we launch into the full discussion. But the Q&A panel is live. So if you in the audience have a question for any or all of our panelists, feel free to load that into the Q&A, and I will do my best to integrate that into the conversation. We are recording this webinar. You'll be able to reference it on the Liftoff PGH platform, and hopefully we'll be using these in the future to continue the conversation. So with that, I'm going to bring up our speakers. And Peter Allen from the Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Pitt, if you want to kick us off with a quick introduction.
Thanks, Sean. Happy to be here. My name is Peter Allen. I've been living in Pittsburgh now for 6 years, but I've known and worked in Pittsburgh for well over 20 now, originally from the UK. I think that my exposure to Pittsburgh has seen a huge change over the last 20 years. And so working now at Pitt, and working closely with the Lifx team has really brought home the emerging strategy for building life science companies, economies, and a hub in the Midwest is something that people are really serious about. And weirdly enough, I think the COVID outbreak and pandemic has, in some senses, served Pittsburgh quite well, in as much as people are now used to remote communication, and I think people didn't come to Pittsburgh very much, but it's easy to get to Pittsburgh via Zoom now, and I think that actually, in a weird way, is helping some aspects of the strategy to build this life science hub.
Great, thanks, Peter. Definitely agree with all of that, and look forward to unpacking your thesis there a little bit more. Next, we have Anne, the founder and CEO of a Pittsburgh-based startup called Noctum. Anne, please give us a quick introduction on yourself and what you're working on.
Pleasure to join the panel today. Thanks for the opportunities. I'm Anne Germain. I'm CEO at Noctum. Noctum is an early stage startup company based in Pittsburgh in the Innovation District, as you said, and we offer software solutions to scale the access and delivery of behavioral sleep medicine with a suite of tools that is both designed for providers and for their patients. We are a small team of 6 right now, growing to 8 soon, and we are growing not as fast as we would like to. So if you know very smart and developers with an entrepreneurial spirit, please send them to the Noctum website to get more information. I've been in Pittsburgh since 2001. I came as a postdoc first, stayed at the University of Pittsburgh, went up the rank to full professor there, and more recently took a leave of absence to develop, grow Noctum and its product.
Thanks, Anne. Getting a little bit of feedback there. And once you are done building Noctum into a global sleep behavior tech empire, I think your personal brand, your really fun to say name, has a future in some type of liquor or cocktails. And Germaine, I can just see as a beautiful bottle of French spirits. But that's for after the presentation. Before we get to happy hour, let me bring up John Grady from Wexford Science and Technology, which is a real estate developer.
Thanks, Sean. It's great to be with everybody today, and particularly with Ann and Peter on the panel here. I'm kind of the new person in Pittsburgh, both individually, and Wexford is coming emerging a little bit as a new organization. I sit in Philadelphia and have spent my career in the public-private space around business attraction and development and community investment for the last 30 years in Philadelphia. And I joined Wexford earlier this year, just in time for everybody to go home from work. And so I've only had a chance to be in Pittsburgh a handful of times this year in person, but Wexford's been digging into Pittsburgh for the last 3 years or so. And we have a project under construction that we can talk about. We have another project in our planning pipeline. But Wexford as an organization, we're certainly a real estate developer. That's the bucket we fall into. But I think we approach real estate development with a little bit of a different perspective. Our mission, and not a lot of real estate developers have a mission, but our mission is to really identify partnerships with universities and academic medical centers and research institutions where we can come in and partner with those institutions, provide a perspective and resources around real estate, and develop the kind of connections that the universities need both internally and externally so that they can access the commercial market and so that the commercial market can access them. And it's really in that interface where we have tried to build our business. We're in 15 markets around the country. We develop what we call knowledge communities, which are mixed use developments that have a real estate component, and we can talk more about the real estate aspect of that. But our knowledge communities also have, either through our work or through partnering with folks like a Lifx or others, we also really focus on a set of innovation elements like shared resources around labs and office space, around network building, around marketing, around talent attraction, and around engaging with the communities that surround our institutional partners. To try and ensure that there's an inclusive view around how does everybody share in the success that's going to be built. And that's why we're not in 100 markets. It's why we're not, a big giant publicly traded company. We have a real focus on what we think can be successful, and quite frankly, that's a big reason of why we're in Pittsburgh. So happy to join everybody today and look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, John. And to clarify, you guys are investing in the city of Pittsburgh in the Innovation District, not in Wexford, Pennsylvania, for the locals.
I've learned a lot about Wexford, Pennsylvania in my 10 months. So yeah, that's definitely true. We are squarely in the middle of the Innovation District, and happy to be there.
Great. You mentioned a little bit, John. I'm going to start with you to kick off the discussion about why Wexford's investing in Pittsburgh. You've talked a little bit about what you look for in an urban and university partner. I'm wondering if you can dig in a little bit more about that. What are the specifics that drew Wexford to Pittsburgh, and specifically your relationship with the University of Pittsburgh?
Sure, yeah, and there's a couple of things that are really at the top of that list. For us, it starts with recognizing some of the assets that you talked about in the introduction, and that you talk about with the Innovation District all the time, right? You have a really unique set of anchor institutions here that are closely connected in terms of their work and in terms of the physical place. So that's a big draw for us. It's unique. I don't know how much, when you look in other places and even a lot of the other communities we're in, if a city has two good research partners, that's a big deal, right? MIT and Harvard are pretty rare. So the Pitt, UPMC, CMU assets are unique and part of it. But digging into that even a little bit, we see strong leadership at those institutions. We see institutions that either have or are trying to really drive a culture around commercialization, commercial engagement, a broader sense of inclusive growth in technology and innovation. And I think that again, we don't see that everywhere. And I think that leadership element at those institutions is part of it, with their own cultures. Quite frankly, we think that that those assets are under leveraged in Pittsburgh. And we think there's an opportunity, and the institutions recognize that. So there's an opportunity to work with the institutions and the community here to create greater value from those fundamental parts. And that was an element. We see specifically that space and lab space and shared spaces and community space are really important. And I think in Pittsburgh, the Innovation District provides that framework. But I think that we see this in lots of cities. Philadelphia, where I sit and have spent my career, until 5 years ago, we didn't have the space to accommodate the private market. Lab space was at such a premium that as it was built, the universities typically kind of gobble it up. And the startup or more established innovation community wasn't able to compete for that, right? So part of what we want to bring is a level of supply in the market that allows for companies to stay in the innovation district, to grow in the innovation district, and to attract other companies in the innovation district. And then the last thing I would say is I think Pittsburgh has a really strong organized community here. You have a great business community, you have good leadership, you have mechanisms for people to grow an agenda. And I think that, again, that's something that not being a Pittsburgher, I don't know how people feel about that. I know in Philadelphia, where I'm from, we're always critical of our business leadership. But I think that from the outside, that's an asset for Pittsburgh, that they're really the right people do talk to each other. And there is shared agenda and prioritization in the agenda. And as someone coming in from the outside for us on Wexford, those are all important aspects of engagement.
Yeah, that alliance of the universities, our public stakeholders, and our business community not only is foundational to InnovatePGH, but it's the reason we have events like Liftoff PGH and the work of the Jewish Healthcare Foundation, really stitching together all three parts of that tool. So it's a really important point that you raised, John. I want to get to the leveraging of the university opportunities with Peter in a second, but before I move on, I do want you to tell us a little bit more about 5051 Center, John. Sure. What's the timeline? Who are your anchor tenants? And why are you excited about that building in particular?
Yeah, so a little bit in our stealth mode, right? Wexford's been working for the last few years with the University of Pittsburgh on a significant investment at Center Avenue there in Baum Boulevard on the Shadyside campus for Hillman. There's going to be about 350,000 square feet of space that we will be delivering at the end of next year. The university is leasing about 250,000 of that in the old Ford Motor Assembly building. So folks that drive by have been seeing a ton of work on that building. And that building is part of what drew us to Pittsburgh. It's a phenomenal asset. The restoration of that building is going to be an incredible anchor for the community. And the University of Pittsburgh will be bringing their kind of high-level research teams in transplant science, in oncology, and in immunology into this facility. So giving them a place to be together, to be in state-of-the-art facilities. And then we will deliver at the same time an additional 100,000 square feet for the market. We'll have 100,000 square feet of purely spec space. It's going to be have all the infrastructure necessary for labs, ceiling heights, floor loading capacity, air capacity, backup power, everything that a lab infrastructure user is going to need. We can have labs, we can have offices, we can have mixes of labs and offices, but we really see that 100,000 square feet of market space as kind of the value add. So when we talk about how do we start to leverage these anchors, bringing that kind of space in close connection to the researchers and in the middle or on the edge of the innovation district is part of the strategy here. All of that will deliver, like I said, at the end of next year. It's about $300 million of investment. And we're excited as we turn the corner into the new year, to really sort of start to become more visible with that space in the market. It's also teed up for us a second project in the district down on Forbes Avenue, where we're going through the entitlement phase now. And it reinforces some of the things you talked about in terms of infrastructure and place. And my sense of a market like Pittsburgh and like other markets is because there hasn't been this built, purpose-built lab space, companies are forced to go into old office buildings, try to sort of re-leverage office space into lab space, or they move out into the suburbs, or they leave the region. And so, we see Center Avenue as our stake in the ground in terms of space, in terms of the type of space it'll be. And ultimately, we see bringing shared labs, we see bringing a lot of programming to the campus there, and creating another center of activity in the innovation district.
Yeah, John, I think that's such an important point. 5051 Center and other private and university-driven real estate projects really begin a next phase of life science evolution for Pittsburgh on the real estate side. Peter, I'm going to throw it to you to talk about the next phase of programmatic evolution and on the infrastructure side. And we described Pitt as the life sciences engine in the description for this series. And that makes the Innovation Institute something like the fuel injector and Lifx maybe the drive shaft, but I'm getting a little out over my skis on automotive metaphors. So let me put those aside and just ask you more bluntly, what is Lifx, and tell us a little bit more about this exciting life science program that is being built at Pitt.
Thanks, Sean. In fact, before we set your metaphor aside, I think it's quite an interesting metaphor for Pittsburgh in that everything you describe requires a lot of very different things to work together for a common purpose. And I think the conversations that you, I, and others have been in the last 2, maybe 3 years, even before I was here, is moving Pittsburgh in that direction from basically a bunch of automotive parts lying around the garage to something that will roll. I won't break into the song from Greece, but you know what I mean. It's anyway, Lifx.
Maybe it's the third event will be a musical.
Oh, right. Okay, good. So Lifx has been around for 2 years now. It is primarily an incubator for life science companies. It also is an accelerator, and some people say, oh, what's the difference between the two? Accelerator is primarily a programmatic, fixed, finite time scale, cohort based at the moment. Series of events over usually 3 months. It's going to be beginning again in the spring of 2021. So the accelerator is cohort based. It's about all aspects of how you create a startup, from regulatory to project management to finance to legal and how the team works and all those kinds of things. And that kind of effort is, I would say it's fairly common in most places where this kind of work goes on. The incubator it's space plus support from a range of advisors. And if you go to the Lifx website, there's an interesting range of executives in residence that are there, primed and ready to support any company that works in the Lifx space. And also you get, say preferential access. You get access to things like speaker series and a whole sense of how to do things. Because when a lot of people that come into these things, they're full of the technology that they've got and what that technology does. And then there's, how do you set up an LLC or whatever, and so there's a whole bunch of that kind of programming from very kind of complex stuff like writing a 501, 510K, sorry, I'm thinking of 401K, a 510 submission through, back to, I've got to write an operating agreement for my LLC. How do I do that? So there's a lot of support there. We have office space and we have some lab space. The lab space is based in Lawrenceville, just off 44th Street. It's about 4,000 square feet of dedicated lab space. And there's office space in Sydney Street on the south side.
Peter, we have a question that I was going to ask you later, but since it came up from one of our audience members, I'll ask it now. Lifx has some exciting news and a new collaboration with the Pittsburgh Life Sciences Greenhouse. Can you very quickly tell us about that alignment and what it means for Lifx and PLSG and maybe the broader life science ecosystem?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the Pittsburgh Life Science Greenhouse Lifx conversation has been, as you know, going on for a while now, and you know, it's one of these things where we're consolidating know-how, expertise, connections, and in drawing on the Life Science Greenhouse long heritage, and I think plugging that into you know, Lifx's you know, expertise in programming and company support. And you know, I'm really interested to see how that pans out. I think people have known PLSG for a very long time. It's done a whole range of different things, from investing to providing programming and so on. So there's a lot that, you know, we can learn from each other and support each other. And I think that, you know, that is part of the let's work together aspect of Pittsburgh that I think is going to really help.
Yeah, so important. Last question, and then I want to bring Ann back up. I often think of and hear of Lifx in the same breath as the University of Pittsburgh. Is Lifx only for Pitt technologies?
Absolutely not. It's the accelerator and the incubator are open to any company that or about to be company that wants to join. In fact, it's very much part of our strategy to, although we started with, you know, Pitt companies in the pipeline, and we've got other companies that aren't part of, you know, membership yet, but we're looking, you know, beyond Pitt into the region and even beyond the region. I think we've had this conversation. Pitt as a life science hub will succeed when and if we start to attract people into some of the things that John was referring to about, you know, the growing infrastructure, the links between UPMC and Pitt and CMU and all those kinds of things. And you know, I expect actually 2021 to be a year where that starts to happen.
Great, we'll hold you to that. Some things are already happening, and Noctum is a great example of what we want the ecosystem to do, to empower brilliant folks on campus and off campus to start companies. Tell us a little bit more about Noctum, and specifically, why did you build a company around behavioral sleep care? Why did you build it in Pittsburgh?
We built a company around behavioral sleep medicine because that's what I do. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, got my degree from the University of Montreal, came to Pittsburgh for my postdoc training here in clinical research and sleep neuroscience. So I have over 25 years of training and experience in behavioral sleep medicine, either the practice or the research side of things. So at Pitt, I had the opportunity to develop and sustain a pretty large research program around clinical sleep research, with research in behavioral sleep medicine as well. And through this research program, was able to develop pretty solid relationship with the Department of Defense and different branches of the armed services to fund the research, both from the clinical side on behavioral sleep medicine, but also as sleep as a way to optimize performance and readiness. And of course, it's very applied to the military, but this kind of research has tremendous implication for performance and readiness and health in the general population. And the same thing on the medicine side. I mean, a lot of medicine actually comes from military medicine. Decided to, so that was basically the core of my expertise, my research program. And eventually on the side, I've been in sleep medicine for 25 years. At the time, it was like closer to 23 years. And you know, we know that it takes on average 14 years for people to get access to treatments that work in sleep medicine. And those treatments, usually we can deliver and see significant improvements within a few weeks. This idea that people go undiagnosed, untreated for 14 years, sometimes more, And that despite all the research that we had done and others have done, of course, in the country and worldwide, hadn't moved that needle yet. It was still it was 14 years when I started. It was still 14 years, 20 some years later. So I thought, if we keep doing the same thing, we're going to get the same results. We can train more clinicians. We can have shorter treatments. We can try to do some of the same thing and do a lot of the research, but the translation of that research into real clinical practice was just taking the same way too long. And by nature, I'm an impatient person. So at some point I decided that if we kept doing the same thing, we would have the same results. And if ultimately I wanted to retire with a feeling that somehow I'd contributed to bringing sleep medicine in the hands of providers and patients that needed it, we needed to take a different path. That's how Noctum was born, basically, to take the clinical science that we were doing and take it onto a commercialization path to try to have this impact. So it's going to be the next phase of the science and how this is articulating. Came in Pittsburgh because, well, Pittsburgh became my home. And also because there are, John and Peter already mentioned that already, the very fast growing scaffolding to support startup companies in life sciences. We're a software company, so we're not a company that needs, space, lab space, but we do need to have a vibrant community of other startup companies at different levels so that we can get the mentorship, the resources, the advices that we can, that we can really, and for a startup company to be successful on the short term.
Yeah, it's interesting. We talked last week about NIH funding. So Noctum's here because you're here. You're here because of the University of Pittsburgh, but that DoD funding, in addition to NIH funding, is that foundation of federal research dollars coming into the University of Pittsburgh. We continue to see really power this next generation of innovation and translation, which I think is really interesting. Curious.
I'm sorry, I was going to add something. I think it provides a very, very solid foundation. It, like, translating this, like using that funding for the fundamental and the foundational research into commercialization effort is the next level of that scaffolding. I think that requires, that is coming together and has a very high potential for impact.
And that was actually my next question for you. You participated in the Lifx program. You're a graduate of that program, as Peter was describing it. How important was Lifx as part of that scaffolding, and how did your participation in the program advance your vision for Noctum?
It's very important from the get-go. So I joined Lifx in the very first iteration, when I think the idea at the time was more of an accelerator than the incubator, but as Peter described, kind of a combination of the two. I mean, taking advantage of the programming, we had our space. The company had, renting space there for the first just me, then two of us early on. The fact that the programming, having access to not just presentation, but also the people who are there, the EIRs, and the time come with a network, come with a wealth of experience and knowledge and connections and contacts that they were very generously sharing and helping. At the time, there were many small startup companies also hosted at Lifx, so there was this vibrant and close proximity of CEOs, some that were more experienced, many actually that were more experienced than me, and that in different areas. But I think that the kind of challenges that you face as you build a startup company is very similar, regardless of the specific focus, area of focus for a company. So those were very helpful to have this close-knit community. Things evolved over time. The other thing that was very helpful too at the beginning is having external speakers, investors, other entrepreneurs coming to Lifx through Lifx to present, to just have small group meetings. That was extremely helpful. And I have to say, I mean, one of the EIRs, Mara McFadden, is actually now working with Noctum and our consulting COO. So I've greatly benefited from the Lifx program before we graduated. We graduated from the program, and now we're still in so we went from the south side to back in the core of Oakland, where my academic offices used to be.
Great, thanks, Anne. You know that you have good EIRs when they're done with their stint if they're working in the startup. So really excited to hear that about Mara. There's a couple of questions popping up in the chat really specifically for you. I'm going to come back to Noctum in a couple minutes about some of your DoD funding and the disease states. But I want to re-highlight or re-elevate the conversation a little bit and bring Peter back in. And Peter referenced this really long development cycle for life science technologies. And, you know, on one hand, we really like to highlight companies like Noctum because, you know, Anne's not just in this to translate tech for the sake of being an entrepreneur. Noctum and a lot of technologies in Pittsburgh are world changing. They're out to improve the human experience. And at Pitt, that goes all the way back to Jonas Salk and the polio vaccine. But it makes things harder because of that development life cycle. So I was wondering if you could address kind of how the life science translation system is different than conventional tech transfer. And within that, what unique strengths and technologies are you most looking for and most excited about commercialization in Pittsburgh through Lifx and the university as a whole?
You know, I think that's an interesting question, Sean. I would say the most obvious difference between a life sciences application or startup and, you know, maybe some other ones is the whole regulatory aspect, and that can add significant time cycles. Although we've seen from recent events that regulatory approval for very new technologies can actually suddenly happen much quicker if the need is there. But regulatory approval is a big one. And I think also for the early stage technologies, moving from, you know, in vitro proof into in vivo proof, which is part of the regulatory cycle, is also not only a time related thing, can be a huge expense. So, I think that to succeed, we will, I mean, this is probably going to sound obvious, but to succeed, we will probably need to have a mix of life science types of startups. I mean, if you look at a lot of these incubators around, there's any number of companies that are digital health and healthcare IT, and you know that carries its own particular burdens, but is relatively quicker than coming up with a new molecule or a new biologic that's going to, for example, treat Alzheimer's. So, you know, I think that we'll succeed by having a range of different things, from therapeutics, and this is the obvious bit: therapeutics, diagnostics, med tech, and digital health or healthcare IT. Excuse me. And I think that Pitt's well placed, Pitt and CMU and UPMC together are well placed to kind of move into that space. And so I think that the challenge is that if you went down a purely therapeutics portfolio, I think we'd be here in 5 years' time still kind of saying, when's it next going to appear? I think we have to have kind of a cadence of things emerging, and that builds a whole story that, you know, from the history that you mentioned for Pitt and Pittsburgh, you know, and beyond. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, it does, Peter. And John, I actually want to stay on this theme that Peter raised of what Pittsburgh's unique strengths are. Wexford's in a lot of markets very similar to Pittsburgh, you know, these kind of mid-sized city, research heavy, What do you guys see as Pittsburgh's opportunity to differentiate itself from a technology level? What are we doing and what can we do that's different than some of the markets where you're already investing?
Well, I think Peter makes, a great point that both within life sciences and within your broader technology innovation ecosystem, Pittsburgh is very diverse, and diversity is really important, right? You don't really, to Peter's point, you don't really want to be in the game of guessing like which one thing is going to happen and investing a lot of time and money into it, right? It's the learning from the Industrial Revolution that diversification is really the driver, right? And that's, again, one of the things that draws us to Pittsburgh. You're right that, we are in places like, Philadelphia and Baltimore and St. Louis. We're at the early stage of an engagement in Cleveland. Very, very similar markets to Pittsburgh from the point of view of technology, but none of them have the really diverse base that Pittsburgh has. And I think from a life sciences point of view, if you really believe that one of the primary opportunities in life sciences is going to be around immune health or immunology or cell and gene therapy, whatever you want to kind of call it, but it's a big sector that's attracting a lot of research attention and capital. It's clearly going to have long-term legs in the market. This combination of artificial intelligence and software and life sciences is going to be the driver of that new sector, right? Peter's point about the time and money it takes to develop these cures, right? These are sectors that are in the cure business. They're not in the therapeutic management business. Injecting things like artificial intelligence into the research process and the clinical trial process and the manufacturing process are going to accelerate the time frames, reduce the costs, and open up even more opportunities for commercialization in the sector. And when you I'm a naive Pittsburgh participant here, right? Like, I'm appreciative of the chance to listen to you folks that have been in this for a long time, but coming at it from the outside, that's kind of an obvious opportunity here, right? And you see, I think one of the really nice things I mentioned in my introductions, you see collaboration among CMU and Pitt and UPMC around some of this stuff already, right? They're doing a lot of DoD work. That's where a lot of this stuff starts. It's where Silicon Valley started, right? And I really do think this intersection of life sciences, artificial intelligence, and software will drive the research, commercialization, manufacturing kind of process everywhere in the future. And Pittsburgh can be a center for that.
Yeah, and John, we've kind of touched on it, but I think we should say it more directly. Pittsburgh 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even sooner, had a challenge with delivering the real estate and the space to support all of the translation, the research, DoD and otherwise. And that's why we're so excited about 5051 Center. It's why we're excited that Lifx has wet lab up and operational in Lawrenceville. We've moved past that bottleneck, and we now have space for companies like Noctum and ANS in the Innovation District and all around the city. Wexford's going to deliver these specialized innovation assets. We have wet lab space readily available in the city and in the surrounding county. And that's one of the most important things, I think, for the audience to walk away from. This perception that there is nowhere to conduct life science commercialization is no longer true in Pittsburgh. Right.
Yeah, and it's going to become more available, and more available for people at all different scales, right? You need the work that Peter and Lifx are doing for companies at that early stage where they might need a couple benches or a small suite, right? We need people to have step out space and scale up and grow space. And if that can be provided, the dream is like that there's a smooth kind of upward trajectory of space and consumption, right? That supply and demand remain relatively in equilibrium. The reality is it's more like a step function, right? Where you kind of build the space and you fill it, and you build the space and you fill it. But what you want to do is you want to reduce the amount of time between the steps in the function, right? You want to make it as smooth as possible so that people don't have to go anywhere else. And I think Ann and Peter both, made a point about I think the other aspect of this is as Pittsburgh looks to grow more commercial enterprise here, making sure the talent pool continues to grow with it. And it's not just the startup talent, it's that scale up talent that, you know, you have seasoned, successful investors and business executives that can come in and support the growth of these enterprises. And I think ultimately that's what makes for a healthy ecosystem.
Yeah, that's a really great point. We've just got about a little more than 10 minutes left. So I'm going to ask the really hard question that hasn't popped up in the chat yet. And Peter, maybe if you want to take a hit at this first, but Anne and John, any thoughts that you have in addition, I'm sure will be very welcome. Globally, there is still a huge concentration of funding on the east and west coasts of the US and London. How can Pittsburgh, and we're not talking about funding infrastructure today, kind of on purpose. So Peter, how does Pittsburgh compete in terms of funding? How can Pittsburgh compete? And is that a limiting factor that you guys are worried about at Lifx and on campus at Pitt?
So I think the answer I'll give you now is different to what I would have said 12 months ago. A lot of people go to Boston, London, San Francisco because they can stumble out of their cupboard that they're working in with their business, and they can go and have coffee downstairs and be sat across the table from someone who's involved in venture finance. That's not so true in Pittsburgh. Well, it certainly wasn't so true in Pittsburgh, but that's changing. And I think one of the things that university is doing is there's a group of people that are actively engaging with VCs, and Lifx is part of that engaging conversation, where we're beginning to talk about partnerships. We're certainly, I'm aware of a lot of conversations going on with pharmaceutical company venture firms as well. And in fact, I would say that I'm involved in running a gap fund for the university. And we got an advisory panel that we're putting together, and half of that external advisory panel is drawn from the finance community, whether it's pure venture finance or pharmaceutical company venture finance. So the situation is changing. Is it like walking down the high street in Cambridge, Massachusetts? Absolutely not. And I don't think it ever will be. However, I think people are beginning to realize, hey, we can talk to anybody anywhere. Let's have a conversation with Pittsburgh. And I think Pitt is leading that conversation. I think CMU's involved in it. There's a degree of involvement from UPMC with UPMC Enterprises and everything that they're doing. And even what Innovation Works is doing with their new setup. So there's a lot more conversations happening now than there was even 6 months ago.
Yeah, that's great, Peter. John, looking at other markets, and as someone who's building a company, any other thoughts about Pittsburgh's strengths or opportunities around actually funding these life science innovators?
I think, from my perspective, and even coming from like a market like Philadelphia, where Philadelphia has historically struggled with the same issues around capital because we're not in Boston or San Francisco. And at some point, number one, you realize the rest of the world isn't Boston or San Francisco either. So a lot more people outside of Boston and San Francisco than there are inside. You also realize that Boston and San Francisco are becoming so crowded and so expensive that innovation is harder to initiate in those markets, and investors are looking to new markets to invest. Capital's the most flexible, fungible, and movable asset in this whole discussion. Talent is not, right? So what I think the opportunity for Pittsburgh, and being new, I don't want to suggest things because I'm sure these things are in motion, but really thinking about how the Pittsburgh Innovation District acts as a front door for capital. And you need to sell the talent and the technologies and the people that are here, just like you sell houses or the way universities attract students, right? You have to sort of market to them. And in Philadelphia in the last 5 years, because of cell and gene therapy, we've seen billions of dollars of capital flow into the city over the last 5 years, which is a huge change. It's taken a few years to make that pivot. And to Peter's point, you know, Pittsburgh has clearly started to make the pivot. But I think that, you know, both corporate venture capital and pure venture capital are looking for the smartest people and the newest ideas. And Pittsburgh has a strong track record of success. And that's what investors want. They want to de-risk their investment, and Pittsburgh can help them do that.
That's such an important point, John. The real estate can't move. Pitt and CMU can't move. The talent is here, and the funding will find good ideas. And I'm loop back some of these questions about funding, specifically to the extent that you can talk about your relationship with DoD. There's a question about if you, where within the DoD you're connected, and if you're using SBIRs for your funding there, but also any other thoughts you have on funding strategies.
For DoD, there are pretty much all the branches and different funding agencies within or divisions within the DoD that has to do with performance or health is going to be interested in sleep medicine or different aspects of sleep, or some are more fundamental sciences. There's grants.gov is a good resource to find not just DoD, but all sorts of organizations that are interested in funding sleep work. Our relationship, I mean, it was really leveraging, I spent 15 years at Pitt developing a pretty solid research program where we delivered on what we said we were going to do, building local and national relationships with different military and veterans organizations. So when I decided to take a leave from Pitt, I actually started working on securing funding from the DoD, and that was just a normal extension. We had done the work to say this needs to be done in the clinical settings. There's a need, we can meet those requirements, but we need a commercial solution. So we went ahead with it, and I was able to secure funds from the DoD before or as I was transitioning from the university to Noctum full-time. For a lot of companies, so we're not doing SBIRs, and we were kind of in an unusual circumstances too, where we already had the funding to start the company, and SBIRs were not necessarily a good match, and it's still not necessarily a good match for Noctum, but they certainly are helpful. I mean, funding is everything, right? And funding yourself too. I left my leave of absence at the University of Pittsburgh is not a sabbatical, right? I was in a very fortunate and very unique position to say I can step out of my very comfortable position for a few years to build and start this company. And there are many people at my stage of life who don't necessarily have this kind of option. So securing the funding to build a company, the little things that we don't know, that I didn't know about as an academic, that are, little things that are expensive, mistakes that can be expensive to build a company, to be able to secure those funds. So these are extremely helpful. I will say that it is true in Pittsburgh, securing these funds outside of the research, and that's also one part of what I was referring to, going from the academic to the commercialization, that there needs to be, I think if we really want to be successful and put Pittsburgh on a map as a true accelerator and hub of innovation that translate into commercialization in life sciences, there needs to be this kind of access to funds for a startup company. And I think there are many ways of being innovative in that area, but right now, my personal experience, I might be completely, I don't think I'm unique, but there might be other sources I'm not familiar with to be able to support that transition and support startup companies.
And Anne, I'm going to ask you a very in the weeds question, and then I'm going to ask another question to start wrapping us up. The question's from the chat, and I don't totally understand it, but you will. What disease states are you working in? And specifically, are you addressing AFSOR and ONR? So that's your in the weeds question. And then to start wrapping us up, you mentioned you're hiring. Who are you looking for, and how can folks be a part of the Noctum team?
So I'm not sure what disease states refers to, because we're in behavioral sleep medicine. So any of the behavioral sleep disorders that basically disorders that don't require pharmacological or mechanical intervention. So that's what we do. And yes, the answer to the other question is yes. So, and I think the person spelled out, but yes, scientific research and ONR the Navy. As I said, I mean, it's a small world, and in sleep there are fewer people even. So within a smaller military research system, you end up working with everyone anyways.
And
oh, and who we're looking for.
there you go.
Yes. So we are hiring, we're looking for developers right now. We have needs that are going to grow out of this, but at this time we're looking for software developers, front end, back end, full stack, DevOps. If you know anyone who's interested, look at the position on our website, noctumhealth.com. Under the career tab, there's information there. My contact information is there too. Please reach out if you have more questions, if you want to apply. But thank you, Sean, for the plug. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Anne. I'm going to keep just very quickly, we just have 30 seconds or so left. More plugs. Peter, you mentioned Lifx just launched an accelerator. How can folks connect and be a part of the accelerator cohort?
Yeah, sorry, thanks, Sean. Go to lifx-labs.com and click on programs, and you'll see the accelerator there. We're open for applications to that program, and we welcome conversation.
Great. And last plug, John, 5051 Center. If you're a corporate partner looking for space, how can they be a part of that development?
Feel free to reach out to me directly. You can reach me on LinkedIn. You can reach me through wexfordscitech.com, our website. We're going to be coming public in the first quarter next year with a lot of information about leasing and activity like that, but always happy to talk to partners interested in growing their presence in the Pittsburgh Innovation District.
Great. Thanks, John, and thanks, Peter and Anne, and frankly, all of you for joining us this morning. If you want to learn more about Pittsburgh's life science ecosystem, you can visit lifesciencespittsburgh.com. And if you want to learn about our unique competitive advantage in Oakland with research institutions, you can find out more and contact me at pittsburgh.id. For those of you staying on the Liftoff track, and we hope that you are, we'll be back next week as part of the big two-day event for Liftoff on 12/16 at the same time. I'll be joined by Gene Kuniselli from UPMC Enterprises, Joe Havrilla from Pitt, and Mike Matisek from our partners at Idea Foundry to discuss the future of Pittsburgh's life sciences ecosystem. We're going to continue talking about this funding opportunity, and so excited about that, and please join us next week. Next up at Liftoff today at 12, the second part of Generation Fempreneur, a fireside chat with Tiffany Kelly, the founder and CEO of Nightingale Apps and Eye Care Nursing Solutions. So definitely don't want to miss that. You can find the link in the platform. And finally, for me, a special thank you to Mara and Megan and the Liftoff team at JHF for hosting us. That's it from me. Thanks to everyone. And Megan, I'll throw it over to you if you have anything to wrap us up.